Jane Goodall, she felt that chimpanzees feel awe, and she said, this they show this awe in response to waterfalls and thunder and big storms, and they kind of get quiet and reverential and move around and dance. And she said, isn't this is probably the beginnings of our sense of awe or spirituality, and the key is and what that really reduces to is being amazed at things that are outside of yourself. And I just think, a life worth living is that, is like, what are the things that are outside of me that are big that I can feel part of?
So, Dacher, welcome to the show.
It's good to be with you, Joe.
Man, such a pleasure. So I've been reading your book, Awe, The Transformative Power of Everyday Wonder. And perhaps for a bit of background about yourself, you're a professor at UC Berkeley. You've been central to the understanding of human emotion in psychological science. You've been cited over 85,000 times. And a place that I would love to start, I guess, to kind of build on from this topic, is you say in the book, after 20 years into teaching about happiness, that you have an answer. Find awe. So I guess the place to start is, what is awe?
Yeah. Thanks for that start too, because, I've taught happiness to tens of thousands of people, and they always ask the question, like, how do I find this mysterious thing? And I think the science of awe justifies that answer. Uh, Joe, to your question, I define awe, and this really was work I did with Jonathan Haidt a couple decades ago, is it's an emotion that you feel when you encounter things that are, for the most part, vast, that transcend your frame of reference. And they're mysterious, or you just don't understand what is happening with your current knowledge structures. So, just thinking about it a little bit more colloquially or informally, awe is it's how we feel when we encounter vast mysteries.
I love that definition, and I
Thank you.
really want to delve more into it. But one question that I had when I was reading it is, from an evolutionary standpoint,
Yeah.
what would be perhaps the evolutionary reason, or if I wonder if you have any insight into why we can feel or why we do feel, or do you have any ideas there?
Yeah, I thank you for asking that. I think it's essential that we approach human phenomena like emotions from an evolutionary perspective. Darwin did it, Ekman, our lab, and so forth. And I think that, in synthesizing all these different studies of awe that I report on in this book and that are happening right now, one function is social, which is awe really engages patterns of thought and action, like sharing and sacrifice, that make you integrate into social collectives, right? We're a hypersocial species. We have all these collective identities. Groups matter to our survival. And awe enables us to be good citizens of groups, which is fundamental, right? It's just a fundamental thing that we have to achieve. And then the second point is more function from an evolutionary perspective, is more cognitive, which is awe helps us gain an understanding of all the systems of the world that we're part of, right? Social systems and family systems and cultural systems, ecosystems. Ordinarily, the mind is very narrow and focused on the here and now, and very circumscribed cause-effect relationships. Awe opens up your mind, and it's like, wow, the Earth is part of the solar system, and I'm part of the Earth, and so forth. So awe really gives us that kind of knowledge, systems-based knowledge, that is essential to survival.
And do we have any idea, perhaps, what part of the brain is kind of allowing us to do this? Is it a higher order process? Where's it coming from?
Yeah, it's funny in writing, just reading everything that's been written about awe, looking at the science, your question to me is one of the great mysteries, which is what happens in the brain when, you have this pattern of feeling, this part of awe where you feel connected to larger things, you feel a sense of spirit or divinity, you feel like there's a fundamental truth that you're perceiving. And all we know right now, and this is, this neuroscience can be simplistic, is when we feel awe, and this is studies in Holland and Japan, US, elsewhere, UK, your sense of self in the default mode network diminishes, right? The default mode network where the ego related processes are activated is deactivated during awe. So that's interesting. The ego death you feel during awe happens in the brain as well, but we don't have answers to the questions of like, why is it that you feel that what you perceive during awe is true? Why is it that you feel this oceanic connection to others? And that's what's exciting about awe-based neuroscience, is it gets us to those processes.
Right. And I think a little bit in the book you talk about some of the great future research that can be done on awe.
Yeah.
And there are many things in
Yeah.
there that I really would love to go with you. But one of the things, I have to confess this to you, and I know I've talked a little bit about this on the podcast before, is I was actually a little bit worried about reading your book.
Oh no.
And the reason was I had a conversation with a psychiatrist by the name of Ian McGilchrist.
Yeah.
And he come on the, he's a brilliant guy. And he come on the podcast and he said that he was, a practice that he'd cultivated in his own life was that beautiful things, he tried not to make them explicit. He tried not to understand how the mechanisms worked. Like he said, he didn't want to know how love worked, relationships happened. He said he tried to avoid doing it because his argument was, in doing so, it would rob it of its power. Conversely, he argued that things like death and disease, we should make those explicit, because in doing so, it diminishes the power of them. So I was a little bit, I thought, this phenomenon that you talk about that has so many transformative powers, I thought, I'm just a little bit worried, but I can tell you, I don't think it's had that effect.
Yeah. It didn't have that effect.
No, definitely not.
Good. Yeah. Well, McGilchrist's intuition is a common one. And that's why we do science, right? There was interesting. There are a couple of common assumptions about awe that turned out to be wrong. One is it's really rare. Peak experiences maybe once in your life. Not true. Around the world, we find people feel awe 2 to 3 times a week, and you can A second is you can't cultivate it. You can. And the third is the subtle one of McGilchrist's observation that because awe is so sacred and it's so inexplicable, and it just hinges upon mystery. If we try to understand whatever makes us feel awe, that thing will lose its power. Music, nature, moral beauty of other people, spirituality, what have you, a fine taste of chocolate or whatever. And it turns out that's not true. We find, the more that you practice awe, the more you contemplate it, the richer it gets, the deeper it gets empirically. When I talk to people who are awe aficionados, and when you're an aficionado, you often find that realm awe-inspiring, right? If you're an aficionado of, Arsenal football statistics or fine wines or clouds, there's a whole cloud spotting society in the UK. People are awestruck by that thing, and the more they dive into it, the richer it gets. And what that tells us, Joe, is that at the very defining quality of awe is mystery. Is we just don't know. And the more we learn, the more we don't know. And awe animates that process of discovery.
Yeah, and this was one of the great things that I took from your book. Is I read about halfway when I was on a plane journey, and about halfway through, I looked out and I thought, yeah, I'm awe-inspired by this plane journey.
Seriously.
I thought the fact that there's this floating thing through the sky that 100 or 200 years ago, this just wouldn't have been possible. So I definitely think that it had a very very positive effect. And one of the things that I liked about it was, I think that it kind of opened my mind to this reflective process that I can take kind of in the position where I really don't understand something. But one of the things that I would kind of love to go back to, perhaps just picking up on the earlier points that we talked about, is one of my other assumptions when I went into reading your book was that when I heard of awe, and when I heard the word, I was thinking about someone I was thinking about these positive experiences of wonder. You know, Usain
Yeah.
Bolt smashing a world record, or standing in front of the Iguazu Falls or the Northern Lights. But my understanding of your work from the book was that you kind of paint awe as more of a spectrum
Yeah.
experiences.
Yeah.
Could you perhaps talk about that?
Yeah. What a deep question. When we use words to describe experiences, right, awe, you come up with these stereotypical images. Usain Bolt, I feel awe for him too, by the way, and I'm glad you bring him up. The Grand Canyon in the United States, a comet coming through the sky. But in point of fact, human emotional experience is on spectrums or dimensions, and it's often there are gradations of intensity. There's softer awe and strong awe, right? There's intense awe. Oh my God, I just saw someone die. And then there's everyday awe, like, wow, I saw a leaf fall from a tree and I thought about how life passes. Um, Awe often mixes with other emotions. So, we use a word and we think, oh, it's just pure awe. But in point of fact, awe can mix with horror and terror and fear and beauty and love. So, and we've done a lot of careful work I report on in the book that really shows that, there are these prototypical experiences of awe, but a lot of our everyday experience is softer, it's more quiet, it's subtler, it's mixed with other emotions. One of the important discoveries there is that when threat comes in and imbues awe, right? Like, whoa, I have this image of God sending me to hell and I feel threatened about my earthly behavior. It's awe inspiring, but I'm terrified. It becomes a different kind of state, profoundly different, our research shows. So always, it's so tricky, and Edmund Burke, the great Irish philosopher, said, we use words to describe feelings, but they're only approximations and they have their biases and they do injustice to reality. And the reality is awe is on a spectrum, has many varieties.
Yeah, and perhaps one thing that we'll talk a bit about later is perhaps awe as an intervention for mental health, topic
Thank
that
you.
I'm very, very interested in discussing.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you open the book and you dedicate the book to your brother Rolf,
Yeah.
um, and you kind of talk. The book opens with you discussing perhaps the final moments of his life. I wonder if you could kind of talk about those moments and the kind of the awe that you talk about experiencing, which I think kind of sets a scene for this broader idea of awe that you discuss.
Yeah. If are you talking about watching my brother pass away?
Yes, yeah, and you talk
Yeah,
about the
yeah,
kind of awe that you went through
yeah,
there. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah. Joe, today we think of awe, and again, this is, I think, why we do science, is to really start to capture the nuances and riches of things like awe, right? And a lot of people, especially in Western European cultures, if you say the word awe, they think of remarkable beaches or skies or being at a concert and dancing with 10,000 people, and it's all really positive. And I think one of the fundamental lessons of awe is it emerges very often during real hardship and trauma and suffering and destruction and the like. And for me, I learned that personally, and this was a fundamental reason I wrote the book, in watching my younger brother die. I had the best brother in the world, Rolf. He was 1 year younger than me. We had an incredible childhood, born in Mexico, raised in counterculture, Laurel Canyon in the late 60s, lots of rock and roll, then moved to the country. And we just had this incredible brotherhood that was just the very fabric of how I live. And then he got colon cancer, fought it with humility and wisdom for 2 years, and died. And at the night of his passing, I was there right by his bedside with my dad and my mom and my daughters and other people, and touching his shoulder and thinking about his life. And then he passed away. And I was I'm a scientist. I believe in evolution. I'm not religious. And Joe, it was incredible. I I saw him lean into death. His face seemed kind of curious and warm to me. I saw space sort of pulsating around him. I felt like some sort of soul in him was moving into a different dimension. Truly, I did not understand. And I felt awe. And a lot of people feel awe when they watch loved ones die because life is so mysterious, death is mysterious. And then what happened is I was blown off the map by his death. I just couldn't make sense of reality. And, like a lot of people who are going through deep grief. And it posed this huge question for me of like, what is life and death? And I think the lesson of that experience, which I write about in a lot of different ways in the book, and it's been such a privilege to talk to people about death, fundamental truth to life, is that here's an emotion, no matter what you're doing in life, that helps you approach the big mysteries, the fundamental questions of life. For prisoners I interviewed, it's like, why were they born in such an unjust culture, the United States, with respect to race? For a musician I interviewed, it was, how can music, when she plays the cello, make her suddenly feel like she's with her grandfather who passed away and was a big figure in her life, right? And for me, at this moment in my life, it was, what do I make of my brother's life, and what is life? Why am I here? And that's what awe does for us. It really points us to seek meaning, depending on the moment of our life.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that, man. And I would just have to kind of pick up on a couple of things there. So
Yeah,
I wonder, just perhaps two questions
yeah.
that I have from there. Is the first one would be, did the cultivation of awe help in the grieving process, for one? And the other would be, has awe kind of changed your relationship or your attitude towards death, which will of course come to us all?
Simple questions, Joe. Thanks a lot. Yeah, but thank you for asking those questions. I wrote this, it was so interesting. I wrote this book. I was clearly depressed. I was anxious. I was gasping. I wasn't sleeping. I lost a lot of weight. My brother we did everything together, and off he goes, 55. And as I was writing this book, we were coming out of the pandemic, and worldwide, people were suffering more depression and anxiety. As I was writing this book, my lab was publishing these papers like, awe is good for your stress, and it's good for your heart, and it's good for your inflammation, and it's good for your sense of perspective on life. And I was like, I gotta go find awe, and that's what I urged the reader to do, and that's what I did. I listened to music in ways that changed how I felt connected to other people. I looked at paintings in ways that taught me that there's light, there's everyday awe around me. I talked to ministers and reverends who said, our sense of mysticism is always evolving, and that's what our minds do as we grapple with these things. I talked to end of life specialists who said, here's how you approach the end of life. And it helped me profoundly. And one of the ways it helped me profoundly is your second question, which is, I, like a lot of human beings, was frightened by death. I had early periods of my life where I really worried about it. I had panic in my 30s, which was really about dying. I became a hypochondriac, and watching my brother die, feeling the awe around it, engaging in this inquiry, fueled by the search for awe, I came out of it like, we don't know. There's probably a lot more to the end of life and beyond than I might think scientifically. And what I know psychologically is I feel my brother around me all the time in visceral, true ways. And I don't fear death like I used to, period. And when I think about it, I think, well, I'm curious about it. And so it had huge influences upon my approach to life cycles and death. And it's been astonishing. This individual who works at Kaiser Permanente, biggest healthcare deliverer in the United States, reached out to me. We've had a lot of exchanges. He's like, I deal with grieving families, right? And we're going to build awe into that because death has awe in it. And so it's been a real eye opener for me.
You talked, but they not only as awe as a, I guess, a kind of as a powerful psychological aid that we can use in
Yeah.
difficult times. But you mentioned also kind of the benefit that it can also have on um, uh, a physical health as well, which
Yeah.
I also found incredible. So one of the things that I would just love to pick up on this is the title of the book, or the subtitle is or the transformative power of everyday wonder.
Yeah.
So when I hear the word transformative, I don't think of fleeting. I don't think
No.
of just an emotion. So
Yeah.
do you really think that awe, and is this what the science is showing, that really it is something that does have a lasting impact upon us?
Yeah. I mean, Joe, you're hitting on some of the big empirical questions. What about the brain? How about this transformative power of awe? Um, People tell you, and I would encourage our audience, like if you think of a big experience of awe, mine was seeing Nelson Mandela come out of prison at this big gathering of 50,000 people. And since then, I've really cared about prison and worked in prison and its injustices. Um, and I think people would tell you, just like that experience, like, yeah, awe changed me. But we don't know empirically. It may be an illusion, right? But we do know, we have data showing awe can help veterans with PTSD for a week. There's new data about festivals where you feel awe, music festivals, that that transformative power of that experience, which has a lot of awe in it, sometimes associated with psychedelics, I might add, leads people to be changed for a year, where they're kinder
Wow.
for a year. So that's suggestive that awe does transform us. And I think that it does, but you're posing the right question, which is, hey, this is just a fleeting emotion. It's 10 seconds long. You're saying transformative? Prove it. And that will be one of the challenges for future research. And I'll also note here, it's interesting. What does it transform? And I think what we've hit in our culture right now, and I've been teaching this in happiness for 10, 15 years, like we're just the culture of self and narcissism and individualism is at its zenith and it's in crisis. We're so self-focused, that's all we think about. We're so individualistic, we now have epidemics of loneliness, right?
Yeah.
And what are the ways in which we can combat this? I mean, in the United States, man, you drive in a car an hour a day by yourself, you go home to your house in the suburbs, you're by yourself. It's hard. And awe transforms our sense of self. It makes you feel connected. It makes you feel like you're part of something big. It makes you feel like you have transcendent meaning shared with others. So I think that's part of the resonance of awe right now is it transforms our sense of self, which we need to.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and you kind of talked a bit there about the Western world, and when I think about it, I think of things like individualistic. I think
Yeah.
of very competitive,
Oh my God.
very anxious. And one of the things that kind of you paint in the book is that there's this idea that perhaps when we experience awe, that can kind of be an antidote to those things. It's an antidote to
Yeah.
thinking too much about ourselves. Is that what I kind of understood from that?
Yeah, and you even up the ante, Joe, with the earlier comment that, hey, this is good for your body. That it can be an aid at any time. And in fact, we just published that paper, and you're one of the first podcasts
Congratulations.
to know of this. Like, we in the heat of uh, the pandemic, we thanks to Michael Amster and Jake Eagle, were Michael is a medical doctor. We had a team create a awe cultivation practice for medical doctors and nurses in the United States. They were watching people die. They were getting COVID. They were understaffed. They were working 16 hours a day. It was one of the hardest times in hospitals in the last 100 years. And all these individuals did is, kind of take a moment, breathe, let your mind wander, put away your devices, And just like you did on that airplane, like think about what you find awe-inspiring right now, you know? And for me, it is, I look at this beanie, I'm like, man, I got this beanie in the Himalayas, and I'll always think of that moment when, getting this from this woman. Um, there's a lot of awe around us, just a minute or two a day. And those healthcare providers were less depressed, less anxious, better physical health over 3 weeks, right? Just a minute or two a day. So yeah, I think that, this is an antidote to our times, is to get out of the self, pause, wonder, wander, give yourself a moment or two, and a lot of benefits to derive.
And perhaps a good point that I kind of mentioned earlier that I would be really, really interested in. Do you think
Yes.
that there could ever be a study done in which all was used as perhaps an intervention for mental health?
Well, they're going to happen, right? And, uh, and this is where, I teach mindfulness, right? And all the mindfulness interventions, John Kabat-Zinn, Mind MBSR, the mindful meditation practices, etc., are interventions. They're now, especially in the UK, they're doing random control experiments where they compare it to clinical intervention, and those fare pretty well. And I think we'll, in the next 10 years, see that with awe. We've cultivated a couple, an awe walk intervention, just this new paper with Michael Amster, Jake Eagle, like, here's how we meditate on awe for a minute. I'm very excited about nature-focused contemplation, which is, get outside. I do this almost every day, and just listen to the sounds of nature, look at the sky for 5 or 10 minutes. That brings you awe. So we will have them in 10 years or so, and we'll see how they do. What I am excited about is they're cheap. They don't need pharmaceuticals. They tap into something that's part of our evolution. So I'm optimistic.
Oh, amazing, man. I will certainly keep my eye out for those.
Thank you.
One of the things that I think, if someone's listening now and,
I hope so.
yeah, I hope so as well. But if someone's tapped in now and they're listening to this and they're wondering, I love the sound of these
Yeah,
benefits. I love the positive impacts it could have on me
yeah,
psychologically, spiritually, physically. But I don't live near the Iguazu Falls, or I don't live
yeah.
near the Himalayas. Um, can we find the extraordinary in the ordinary? Is that possible to do?
I think that's the fundamental challenge that all of this science in my book issues to people is, and it would have been a great subtitle, and I should have talked to you earlier, Joe. Finding the extraordinary in the ordinary. And in fact, we studied people in 26 countries. We gathered their free response stories of awe. We coded them. And the central theme was the extraordinary in the ordinary. We find awe in the moral beauty of people around us, just how generous humans are, how much courage they show, and it brings us awe. You can find awe in almost any piece of nature. I did an awe walk study, and a lot of people got to walk in parks, etc. But a teacher led her students on awe walks in the Bronx, in a really tough urban area, and they found awe in a little patch of grass. One of the underappreciated everyday sources of awe is music. And I challenge our listeners, man, just think about a piece of music that made you cry or give you goosebumps. Go listen to it and ask yourself, why that matter so much to you? For me, it was Within You, Without You, Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I heard that in 1970 with my family, and it kind of defined my life. Like, oh wow, there's this Eastern form of transcendent self, that you could go after as a human being. So it's around us to find. And most experiences of awe aren't looking at the giant waterfalls or hugging the Dalai Lama or whatever, or Nelson Mandela when it's more about finding it around you, the extraordinary and the ordinary. And that's our challenge.
when I first picked up the book, I was thinking about some music, because that is one place where I find a lot of awe.
Yeah.
And I was kind of going through the book, and I was thinking back to, I watched the conductor Andre Roux. I think he was in Belgium, and he did an outdoor performance of Ode to Joy. And I was watching the crowd, and you can just see so many people there, just in floods of tears from this one
Oh my God.
3-minute performance. What do you think it is about music that can kind of have that, I guess, transcendent experience upon us?
You're giving me the hard question, so I appreciate it, Joe. The brain and death and and music. Yeah. It's I think the first thing is and I have a chapter on music, and I had that experience too. Where it's just like, and everybody has. You go see. I'm embarrassed to say, like, I revere Iggy Pop. Just saw him recently, 75, 76, and I was just tearing. I was like, I've seen him for 35, 40 years, and he always gives me awe. And I was crying and just like hugging this guy I didn't know. And like a lot of people feel at music, but I think there are a couple things about music that are special portals to awe, transcendent awe. One is the collective nature of it. Very often we see music with 6,000 people, 400 people, 100,000 people, and we're moving together, collective effervescence. And
Yeah.
that's incredible. So that's one. A second is that that it has, and Susan Langer, who I really drew upon as a philosopher, and she writes about how it's a special kind of language, right? It represents meaning, right? You hear music and you're like, oh, this is about love, or this is about joy, or terror, or injustice, the Sex Pistols, etc. And it's a way in which we understand these, what she calls life patterns. We're like, oh, now I kind of understand death through music, or love. And the qualities of that experience are really different than other forms of awe. People often talk about, when you hear music, you can move around in time in really interesting ways. Like, whoa, I'm thinking about when I was 6 years old and I fell in love, and so it has these transcendent qualities to it that teach us about what the big themes of life are. And we do it collectively, and make sense of reality as the collective species we are. And so it's a great thing to study, is to figure that out in greater detail.
Yeah, and I think we've touched upon some really great places where people can find all, like, moral beauty in nature,
Yeah,
music. And one of the things that I really like about music is the accessibility of it, because
yeah,
I think that perhaps, someone might think, that if there's a mystique around, or they might think, well, if I don't have a ticket to, watch Usain Bolt in person in the ground, then perhaps I might not experience it. So this would be a question that I would love to ask, and you kind of touch on this in the book, and that would be, where do you kind of see the relationship between wealth and awe?
I was really worried about that question. Again, it's back to these stereotypes of awe. Like, well, I heard this guy talk about being in the most exclusive resort in the world on the Australian Barrier Reef, and it's $4,000 a night, and you're like, I couldn't do that. Or hop on a plane and go to the Northern Lights, etc. And or listen to the symphony, and there are these wealth connotations of awe. uh, the wealthy often try to own awe. They try to, have the awe-inspiring house or collection of wine or whatever it is. And I, as you may know, do a lot of research on inequality and social class. I grew up poor, so I was really worried about that. Like, well, wow, am I studying an emotion that's just for the privileged? And in point of fact, Paul Piff and Jake Moskowitz published this nice study, a nationally representative sample of people in the United States. So it kind of maps onto who we are in the US. And the opposite is true. The less money you have, the more you feel awe. You can come up with a million explanations of that finding, but one of the intriguing implications is that money gets in the way of awe. And I believe that. I really believe that money institutionalization, ownership get in the way of awe. And so it tells us, and it's interesting just to Ralph Waldo Emerson, a great American thinker, he suffered this really big blow in his career when he gave a talk to the Harvard Divinity School, which he was affiliated with, and he said, we can't institutionalize spirituality. You have to go out and find it as an individual. And I think that's true more broadly of all. Like it's got to speak to you. And most often it doesn't take any money whatsoever. You can listen to a piece of music on Spotify. You can go out and look at the sky. You can think about what Mahatma Gandhi did, right? And it's there for, and in fact, money is an impediment to awe. So important to remember.
One conversation I had on this podcast that kind of really comes to my mind in regards to that was I had a conversation with the psychiatrist Anna Lemke from Stanford.
Yeah, I know her.
She was fantastic.
She
And
is, big book, yeah.
Yeah, and she was talking to me about the chemical dopamine, and the interesting thing is that how we kind of habituate to what we have, and this leads to the kind of the wanting more and more. But I suppose that if you have more and more and more, in my mind, that kind of means that you need more to be satisfied, to the point where you're on a $250,000 submarine trying to see the Titanic and all these different things. So I wonder perhaps if that is the reason why, or one of many reasons. Perhaps that does have something to do with it. If you have everything at your fingertips, things kind of perhaps lose their meaning, they lose their specialness, perhaps.
Yeah, man, that is a really deep question, and we have this neurochemical or neurotransmitter dopamine does a lot of different things, but it really is, in some sense, Brian Knudsen and Haber and others like, Schultz, it's really about going after things that are rewarding and exploring the environment to find them, right? Dopamine is associated with exploration and curiosity. And then, as is true of every feature of the human design, how we experience that depends on the cultural context. And if I live in Las Vegas and go to a casino, to Lemke's addiction point, and a culture is designed in a way that takes my dopaminergic tendencies and puts them into gambling and slot machines and prostitution and, et cetera, we're in trouble, And so I think one of the important lessons from your question, Joe, for everybody is like, we're only as good, awe is great. It can make you curious and rigorous in thinking and calm, and you can share with others, but it's only as good as what we do with it culturally, right? What we build for awe. Do we have museums or Nazi rallies? Do we have, phenomenal pieces of music or cult leaders? And that's our task, is to put them to good uses as a culture.
One point that I love from the book that you highlight of people, I guess, perhaps in low dopaminergic environments, but still managed to find awe, was when you gave talks at prisons. Yeah. And you talk about how you spoke to a group of prisoners, and you were kind of perhaps a little bit apprehensive to, but you seemed quite astounded by some of the results that you have. So I wonder if you could talk perhaps about that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It brings tears to my eyes to think about that. I have done different things. The American incarceral system is brutal. It's one of the worst in the, kind of the Western European world. And I got invited to go into San Quentin prison as part of what's called restorative justice, just where prisoners are leading groups to apologize, make amends for their crimes. And I was the speaker that day, and I think every citizen should be required to go into a prison and see what we do to the people who commit crimes. American prisons are brutal, and I was in there, and I was the smallest guy in the room, even though I'm a large guy, and I was just one of a few people from the outside, I was like, wow, this is an unusual moment here. And so I was giving this talk on awe and gratitude, and I um, I got to this moment, and I love asking people, like, think about a time when you felt awe, because it gets us away from the stereotypes we've been talking about, Joe. You know, like when did you last feel awe? Tell
Well,
me.
the last time I felt, or well, there's two times actually. The one which happened to me yesterday was I was on this flight home, and I was thinking to myself, I just can't believe that I'm in this floating piece of steel going through the sky. That couldn't happen. But the other one is I'm regularly in awe that I can do these Zoom conversations that I have no idea how they work with people from all around the world. that it just wouldn't have been possible even 20 years ago. I mean, for me, that just leads to so much curiosity and wonder. So they would be too.
Man, you're the first human being ever to have Zoom awe, which are all about Zoom. That's amazing. Well, so I love that question because it just makes you suddenly appreciate, like, God, this is everywhere, right? And so there I am, I'm standing in front of 180 men in blue. The conditions are horrible, prison's horrible. Their lives, we now know, are shortened by 20 years. They eat crappy food, they get beat up by correctional officers, et cetera. And I was like, I got to ask these guys, like, where do they find awe? And otherwise, what's the point of my doing my work if it can't speak to all humans? And I asked them that, like, tell me about a moment you felt awe. And, we had this awkward moment. And they're like, And then they start raising their hands. And it's like, my cellie, my roommate, getting to hug my granddaughter, getting my high school diploma, studying law to figure out the mistakes that were made while I'm here, the light outside, somebody said the light, reading the Quran, I was just like, oh my God, these guys, if they can feel it, when a whole system is like smashing their spirits, we all can, and the rich, it was the best set of answers I've ever heard. It was almost like, these are the kind of answers that somebody you would think who is spiritually enlightened would offer you, like, just having the freedom to think or looking at the light outside. I was like, wow, this is a very powerful human tendency to feel awe.
Perhaps it's time to wind down. I wish I could keep you here all day.
Me too.
But I got a couple more questions for you before we perhaps sign off. Tell our audience where we can get your book and where we can connect with you, etc. But one thing perhaps I would be very interested to know is, are there any impediments to, or any enemies of awe that can stop us experiencing it day to day?
Yeah, and I think everybody would have their hypotheses about the enemies of awe, the barriers or the impediments, and in some sense, a lot of our culture works against it. So the life on the smartphone works against the feeling of awe. No one in our study of 26 cultures mentioned an experience on a smartphone. I just think the very nature of it, the algorithms that make it efficient, how small it is. Yes, you can connect to other people through Zoom. That's amazing. You can listen to music from around the world, but you got to do that in the right frame of mind that is not cultivated by a smartphone. Materialism, and money. I cited the empirical finding, wow, the more money you make, the more you rise in our materialistic world, the less awe. That's worrisome. I think there's something about time that we've become so efficiency minded, just like, oh, I'll tell you a funny story. Efficiency minded, we don't wander, we don't drift, which was really important. It's important to young people. I did a lot of drifting. My story was, I was in Amsterdam visiting collaborators, and I was like, okay, I'm in this one part of Amsterdam. I got to get over to the university. Google Maps. How do I get there? And it had this fastest route, which dumped me into the pornography drug section of town, which is the ugliest part of town. And I walked there a couple of days, and I was like, I'm hating this, And then I was like, life Google Maps, the whole idea of the fastest, most efficient way to get somewhere is antithetical to awe, where you need to wander and get it wrong and go down the wrong street. So I shut it down, I wandered and suddenly found a lot of awe in Amsterdam. So I think we got to rethink our approach to time, and efficiency. So those are some broader levels. And then obviously, things like environmental threat, the degree of religion in a culture may actually work against certain kinds of awe. And I think that's a task for future research to really tackle. Is to think about what's getting in the way here. Why can't I just pause and wonder about things once or twice a day?
Yes, to the people listening, leave a comment below. And I'd love to kind of ask just a couple more questions before we sign off. Is if you were to issue a task, not a task, a challenge to
Yeah,
myself, to our
yeah,
audience, to help us perhaps cultivate some more
yeah,
awe in our lives,
yeah.
because I'm certainly sold on the transformative power that this can have. What would the kind of what would the challenge be, perhaps?
Well, I think it's twofold, and we've thankfully done experimental work on this, which is there is this awe mindset of finding, as you nicely said, Joe, the extraordinary in the ordinary, which is just, you know, stop for a moment, pause, don't worry about what you're going to get done the next 5 minutes, put away your devices, and just open your mind to what's mysterious about what's in front of you or what's big, right? You did it on a plane. Most people are tense and anxious on a plane. I've done that on planes. So that's the mindset. Pause, breathe, open. Don't worry about efficiency. You can do that when you're walking. I find a lot of awe in walking, as a lot of people do. And the second challenge is really for our listeners to go to those 8 wonders that organize the book of moral beauty. Think of someone who inspired you. Nature, go out and look at the clouds. Just look at them for a minute. Music, visual art, big ideas. There are 8 wonders that can bring us awe, and just get close to them, one of them. On my way home, I look at these big trees and just think about their time on Earth, and it brings me awe. So it's actually really easy to, as you said, be part as a nice aid in our life to finding meaning.
What makes a life worth living?
You know, obviously, awe is about life worth living, meaning, if you will. This is why Dacher Keltner is here, or one of our listeners. Your own identity, what we're doing. But I think that when writing this book, certain words kept coming back to me: mystery, wander, and then things that are larger than the self. Jane Goodall, she felt that chimpanzees feel awe, and she said, this they show this awe in response to waterfalls and thunder and big storms, and they kind of get quiet and reverential and move around and dance. And she said, isn't this is probably the beginnings of our sense of awe or spirituality, and the key is and what that really reduces to is being amazed at things that are outside of yourself. And I just think, a life worth living is like, what are the things that are outside of me that are big that I can feel part of? And if you can answer that one, you're in good shape.
I love that answer, man. Where can these guys connect with you, and I guess where they can connect, where they can get the book, and anywhere else you'd like to send our audience? I'll check out.
Yeah, dacherkeltner.com. And then you can get the book on Amazon or your local bookstores. And then the Greater Good Science Center, greatergood.berkeley.edu, has a lot of good stuff. But dacherkeltner.com and just on Amazon. It's there. Please read it and tell me what you think.
Everything will be linked below. Dacher, thank you so much for coming on.
What an amazing conversation, Joe. Thanks for your terrific questions.